Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Justin Grote. I'm a data center solutions architect here with Ally Digital. Can you guys see me okay? Take a look at the chat. Make sure you can hear me okay. All right. So coming to you here from the bridge because, this is BridgeConf, so you got to be on a bridge. I'm here on the Star Trek Enterprise D bridge, so that's how we're going to roll this way. My presentation today is on PowerShell 7. Going to talk a bit about mostly what's new in PowerShell 7. The main audience for this are people who have been using PowerShell 5.1. You maybe kick the tires with 6 or 7. This is kind of go through a lot of the what's new, what's available, and give you a real good sense of what's there and reasons why you may want to upgrade. If you're already experienced with PowerShell 6 or PowerShell 7, there's a little bit of stuff in here too that we go a little deep into. But for the most part, my goal here is for those of you who are experienced with Windows PowerShell, have a general idea of PowerShell concepts, and just kind of want to know what's going on with PowerShell 7 and what's going to be a little new, which will segue very well into the presentation after me, which will be the PowerShell team doing a Q&A. So you can ask plenty of questions based on the things I show here, or questions about what's next for PowerShell with PowerShell 7.1, etc. My Twitter handle's there at Justin W. Grote. I got a lot there. I have a GitHub and a GIST, which I'll get to at the end, with all kinds of examples as well. But let's go ahead and get started. As far as questions go, I do have the chat up here, and I can see when those questions come in. But as I mentioned earlier, I'll try to have my helper take care of that. And given kind of the limited time we have here, I'll probably just only have a couple question breaks till we get to the end, and then we can go in more deep. The nature of this kind of presentation is a lot of the questions tend to get answered in like the next 5 minutes of my presentation. So I'll try to catch those if I see them. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is the PowerShell Hero. If you don't know, this is the mascot for PowerShell. And the great thing about this is that she's gotten some upgrades as part of this. There's a large amount of performance improvements that have occurred that have enabled her to really get some greater performance, just basically both improvements that have occurred in PowerShell Core and PowerShell 7, and then also just by the nature of this now being built on top of .NET Core 3.1, just some inherent performance benefits there. It might be really tiny on the share, but at the bottom, the colors of these things will indicate them. So for instance, some of these things I'm going to talk about were from PowerShell 6, but so those will be highlighted in white. And there are also some features that are currently experimental in 7 that you can enable using a command, but aren't technically like supported in 7, but maybe supported in the future. New improvements to error views and the way that those errors are displayed. Some real improvements there, and makes it much easier to kind of keep your focus on your problems and keep yourself more productive. Invoke REST method and invoke web request have been completely rewritten. Those are now done in such a way that they use a new library, and they have tons of new features that make them much more suitable to interacting with REST APIs or any kind of web requests, and really be able to power that up. Got a note about needing to hydrate. I did hydrate. I have my hydrate here. It's teleporting, but so definitely make sure that you hydrate as part of this. I'm going to as well. Debug on exception. One thing when you're working with programs, you're debugging them, and unfortunately we didn't have the really cool debug session to go through a lot of the really nice stuff. We all hope Jap's okay. But as part of the debugging, one of the things you can really do here is you can break whenever there's an issue in your code. So rather than have to, if your issue is in loop 46 of 57 of a for each loop, trying to nail that down and lock it down can be tricky, or you can just throw it when it happens and be able to just break to that location. So really, really helpful, really able to help, again, be more productive, nailing down where those issues are. For each parallel now, if you have for each loops, you can now actually have those commands operate in parallel and get a much better performance out of things, especially actions that like work against an external system where it has to wait against something, or things where certain actions may time out or take a while and you want to do them in parallel. If you're familiar with using like jobs or thread jobs or run spaces, this is basically implementing for each with run spaces, but done in a very simple way that you can use very, very quickly, very efficiently. PowerShell remoting now supports SSH. So if you have a Linux system with an SSH, or even a Windows system using the Open SSH server, it has the ability to, you can now use SSH as your transport, as in addition to WinR, the traditional WinRM way that you've had. it can just be done over SSH. And that's not just like SSHing into a system, it's like doing a PowerShell remoting as you're used to, which is being able to import commands, do implicit remoting, explicit remoting. You do all that over SSH to a Linux system, to a container. Really powerful stuff, really makes it more flexible to work with remote systems as if they were local. Windows module compatibility, a big step up in the PowerShell 7 is the inclusion of a lot of the APIs and such as a result of .NET Core that were missing previously. But even then, there's still going to be gaps. There's going to be modules that are still written for Windows PowerShell. So there's basically a shim that's been implemented that makes this a lot more seamless. You can import Windows PowerShell modules, and it'll actually start up a Windows PowerShell instance in the background and implicitly remote that so that those commands feel like they're native when they're in fact running in a Windows PowerShell instance. So that helps cover a lot more of the gaps where like you want to use the Active Directory module, you want to use the SharePoint PnP Online module, but you want to write the code in PowerShell 7 and have PowerShell 7 be your primary, but there's a couple things you need to do to pull that stuff in. That's where this comes into play and makes it really easy to be able to use those modules that aren't yet ready for PowerShell 7 in PowerShell 7 in a manner. The new Temp PS Drive, this was added in PS6, but also very relevant in 7. This provides a really nice cross-platform way to access wherever your temporary drive is. So when you need to write temporary files, save temporary files, you now just have this as a drive. You can just go to temp : and be able to use it. If you're familiar with Pester and you're used to like the test drive for doing that kind of thing, very similar, but it's built right into PowerShell 7 and available to very quickly write temp files without having to do like env temp or do the IO path get temp file, you know, kind of more obtuse syntax, much easier way, and it's a PowerShell drive, so it supports all the stuff you're used to doing with a PowerShell provider. Invoke DSC Resources is partially supported in 7 in the sense that you can now invoke DSC resources from within PowerShell 7. This is an experimental thing, you have to enable it, but because most DSC resources are basically just PowerShell methods of get, set, test, you can use those. So now with PowerShell 7, you can invoke those. The whole LCM and everything about DSC is not there yet, but you at least have the ability to do some DSC resources, and if you're doing any kind of configuration, you're able to do that. The marker there for is Temp PS Drive, the same as Temp. Sort of, it is on Windows, but the nice thing about the Temp is that it's cross-platform. So if you're on Linux, you'll get the Temp for wherever Linux is for your thing, whether that's /tmp or user share temp, depending on how your configuration is. Allows you to write your code to be more OS agnostic. If you just reference that temp drive, doesn't matter if you're running on Windows, Mac, or Linux, it will always work, as opposed to having to do, if it's this, then use the temp variable. If it's this, then discover it this way, etc. There are some new operators that are available. These are pretty familiar to people who are using other programming languages. They're pretty standard syntaxes for these, and now they're available. If you use Bash a lot, you may use these pipeline chain operators, and or. Basically, these are ways to just very shorthand do, if this command works, then do this, or if this command doesn't work, then do this. I'll do a couple quick examples of those, but basically they're just nice little shorthands, where in previously PowerShell, you have to write this kind of very long command to get this to work. What you end up doing here is you can just do test path this and do this. And if the path isn't there, like say test path this file and remove item that file. If the file isn't there, it never runs the remove item. So it makes those kind of test and do actions, or do something like save this file and then open it. But if there's a problem, don't. You just do save file and open file. And if there's an issue with the file, it doesn't work. Conversely, you can do test path or, which is the double pipes, and basically test this path. And if it's not there, do something like create it or create a directory. So things where you used to do if test path this, and then the brackets do this, just a shorter, easier way to like one-liner that. Now, these aren't backwards compatible with PowerShell 5.1, but if you're writing scripts that are going to be only PowerShell 7, like in Azure Functions and such, it can really help you kind of get those things terse. It's also really good when you're just working interactively. The ternary operator is also available. That's basically another kind of shorthand to say that you have a condition where if you would do like an if this, then this, otherwise this, it's just another shorthand way to do that. And then null conditionals and null OSs are just ways to work with null operators in case if something is null. Just another very nice shorthand way of testing for null and then doing an action on it. Test connection has been revamped. It behaves much more like ping, does kind of more ping style output if that's what you're used to, but that's just sort of for the default, like out to console view. It's much more robust. It can do port testing, do a lot more, much more configurable for the timeouts. I still plug my Invoke Nmap module if you really need to go on steroids with this kind of thing. But for kind of simple testing, it's much more powerful, much easier to test connections, test that other servers are there before you do something. And finally, last but not least, it runs on .NET Core 3.1 LTS. So it follows the same support lifecycle as .NET Core 3.1. It's been aligned to that, and releases are going to kind of go with that. But by being on top of .NET Core 3.1, you get all the benefits and all the ecosystem that exists in .NET Core 3.1. So everything that you can call, every action in .NET Core 3.1, as well as now all the visual stuff is back. So like out the grid view is back, out printer if you've been using 6.2.3, clip is back. All those commands that used to not work with PowerShell 7 now exist there. And yeah, Alex has posted a document that sort of shows the PowerShell compatibility. That is a great document, which I will bring up here real quick, and hopefully I won't break anything. Okay, so this is not the one that I'm thinking of, but there is a document that is basically a table that shows all the compatibility and what commands work cross-platform, et cetera. PS Script Analyzer also has new functions where if you're writing a script, you can actually see if that script is going to have commands that don't work in 5.1. So if you're writing in PowerShell 7, you use the ternary operators like I was showing, it can warn you that this script will break in 5.1. So just keep those in mind when writing new scripts. All right, so that's the general overview. So let's start digging into a couple of these. So let's start with the performance improvements. Here are a couple commands that we have available that will just get some information. So one gets all the earthquake data that has occurred in the last month. The other one is all the words that are in War and Peace. So you can take each of these and run these commands and test them, and just here's an easy way to just get a couple easy data sources to test some performance. So this is the performance under standard Windows PowerShell on kind of a typical box. I ran on my Surface Laptop 3 here with nothing else running. So pretty decently performing box. Ran about 5 times, took the average. Here's kind of your normal time. So like to convert the data from CSV, not bad, about half a second. To group them took a while, took about 64 minutes to take all the War and Peace words and group how often those words occurred. Format and hex took a while. Do for each object took about 2 seconds. And then to go through, get all the War and Peace words and sort them uniquely took about, took quite a while. It took about 100 seconds, about 2 minutes. So under PowerShell Core, a lot of these get benefits just from being on .NET Core 3.1, but a lot of them also get benefits from enhancements that were made in 7. You can see there's some very dramatic improvements in these areas. So for instance, convert from CSV is 2.5 times faster. Format hex is 33 times faster. That one was actually fixed up in the latest version. And sort is 20% faster due to some fixes that were made there. So, if you're just doing kind of a one-line thing, these, as you see, sometimes the timing's not that big of a deal. But if you're doing some real heavy work and you're doing a lot of data processing, inputs, outputs, working with SQL, all that kind of stuff, all this level of internal performance improvements, just by starting to run your scripts on PowerShell 7, you get all these performance improvements for free without even changing any of your code. So if you take a 5.1 script and you run it on 7, these are some examples of how your code will just work better without you having to change anything at all. So that's like right there is one very good reason to start considering maybe moving some of your scripts to 7 or starting to run them in a 7 runtime. I have here some additional nerd stats, which come from Doug Fink. He did some tests of various types of sorts, et cetera, and shows kind of the relative performance that occurred with those. So some more information, some more kind of goals about those if you kind of want some more details. All right, so we've kind of covered information about how performance has improved. And so let's go into sort of one of the net new things we have, which is for each parallel. As far as the Windows, I see a question about PS snap-ins. It doesn't really, it kind of works, but I mean, because they are technically Windows modules, but I mean, I've never tested them. So there was a question about the comparison. That comparison was against PowerShell 7. A lot of the improvements came in 6, but basically assume anything I'm talking about now, I'm talking about 7. Some of this stuff applies to 6, but it may not be net super new in 7, but assume most of the stuff I'm talking about is tested on 7. So let's get back to here about for each parallel. So here's an example of some hosts that I want to test. I have a list of hosts: Google, Facebook, Amazon, Yahoo, Office. I just kind of maybe want to do a quick, simple test to make sure that these sites are up. Maybe I'm just doing a general internet test and I want to set up an alert to see if those are okay. So a typical way you would do this in Windows PowerShell is you would use a for each loop and use test connection, maybe kind of slow it down there, and then select the object and just kind of see my destination, the status. So let's see how well that works. So run that command, and you see it's kind of coming in, it's streaming, but the entries are kind of coming in slowly because what it's doing is it's hitting each entry individually. So what that kind of looks like is if we were to take our for each, it's basically taking that test connection, waiting for it to complete, moving on, moving on, moving on. So we're kind of stuck in this parallel situation. Now, what if one command takes like 30 seconds? Our script is done waiting for that command to go. So there's multiple ways to solve this. In PowerShell 5.1, you can use PowerShell jobs, but those are kind of inefficient because they have to spawn whole new PowerShell processes. You can use run spaces, but run spaces aren't very intuitive. There are modules that help with that, like thread job, but even then it's a little tricky. So what if this was a little bit easier? So in PowerShell 7, what if we were able to just simply fan this command out? So the way that you can do that, if you have an existing 5.1 code and you want to be able to do this kind of fan out, this is the only change you have to make. Just add -parallel to your for each command. And what that will do is that it will take whatever is in your code block and fan it out to run spaces and do them in parallel. Now, if you reference anything outside that script block, there's a little more work you have to do. But effectively, for a lot of type applications, especially for very simple for each loops where you're just processing the objects and adding information to them, that's the only change you got to make. So let's see what this looks like now when you run it. Completed almost instantaneously, because what it did was it fanned out all those queries and ran the test connections separately and got back the results separately. So whereas before we saw it took about 3 to 5 seconds, this time it completed almost instantly. So you have to be a little careful about your memory management and your CPU management. There is a small memory leak that exists in this currently for 7 that will be fixed in 7.1. But for the most part, this is a great way to speed up your scripts and speed up anything where you're fanning out to multiple systems, testing multiple systems, fanning out to multiple APIs, or running multiple API commands like getting information and trying to pull it together. These are ways that you can eliminate some of those waits that are occurring without having to learn a whole lot about parallel processing, without having to learn like asynchronous code, just using that parallel switch. So moving on to the next thing, when you need to troubleshoot errors, there are issues that can come up. And so let's talk a bit about some of the new error handling and error views that occur in PowerShell 7. So when we have a command and we want to run it, when we throw it, this is kind of what you're typically used to seeing, is this oops and a lot of junk. So we now have this new concise view that when you do it, you can see that you get this much shorter message. You don't have all the extra stuff. You don't have the stack trace. You have just the information that you want to see very shortly. So this is really helpful when you're running commands and you just want to see just that nice clean message. This is what failed. Especially when if you generate a lot of errors, you don't get that wall of red that a lot of people are used to and really turns off a lot of new users. Be able to just have like a nice, simple, concise message really helps when you're just kind of testing, messing around with things, and you generally know where the issue is. You can always turn on the other view at any time, like I said, just with that command, with that environment variable, that variable. And you also have another way of getting this information. So you can leave this on by default, but if you need to get more information, so this is a quick demo of if you're running a script and you do it, you get a little bit more information, but it's a lot nicer than it used to be. Whereas before you saw that kind of wall of red, now you get this nice display that shows you exactly what line it occurred on, where it occurred, and what the error was. So this is very super useful. Again, when you're working on scripts, etc., it lets you kind of dial into where your issue is very quickly. So let's get back to get error, which was what I was speaking about before. So get error is this new command that exists in PowerShell 7 that you may be familiar with, doing like $error bracket 0 bracket and digging into that object to try to find your information. That tends to be kind of an advanced operation, especially if you're not a super experienced PowerShell person. Now you have this command, just get error. It supports a lot of options, but by default, you can just do get item. I just did there to generate an error. And if you do get error, you get all this additional detail. And as you can see, I just shrink, scroll up, scroll up, scroll up. You get this, if you want the fire hose view, you've got it right here. Now, this is still a PowerShell object, so you can filter it. You can do get error, pipe where this, or get error, and then drill down into the properties. But there's a lot of really helpful information here. So for instance, the type of the exception is right up front there with error exception type. And so typically if you're doing like a try catch and you want to catch an error and do something special, it used to be you had to drill into the object and get into that. Now you can just do get error and find it and be able to trap on that very, very simply. So very, very useful, much nicer way of accessing and working with errors. Okay, so let's go a little bit more into, speaking of error handling, let's talk a little bit more about the process of handling errors. So here's an example of an error that you would typically throw that I showed earlier. But this time we're going to set error action preference equal to break. So I'm going to run my script. It's going to throw. Now this time, instead of actually erroring, you can see it actually broke my script and it broke into the debugger at that point. And so I typed the little K and it showed, okay, that's where I am in the script. And if you're familiar with the debugger, it works quite well. As far as the error view affects whatever, there's a question about does the error view value differ contextually? So it will always affect basically your host. So that errors kind of get passed up. Like if you have an error that happens deep in a script, it gets passed up to the next thing, which gets passed up to like your VS Code host, which eventually makes it to the console. And whatever setting you have for your error view in the console is what ultimately gets displayed. Because all the error view does is kind of adjust the display of what's shown. It still gets emitted as an error record object. And you'll see this if you do, and in fact, I can kind of just show, if you throw an error, the error itself is a special type of error record. And whether you have normal view or concise view shown, that object comes. It's just how it's displayed to you is the exact same, if that makes sense. So it's all just based on what your console view is. And I think now with PowerShell 7, I don't know, I've been running concise view for so long, but I believe it is now the default with the release version PowerShell 7 that is now concise view. Somebody in chat can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But again, if you liked the old format, you want the wall of text, you can always change it back at any time by changing it back to normal view. All right, so back to this. As you can see, we have our debug and where we're at. So that's the command line view. If you're debugging on the command line, really helpful if you're like remoting, you can just have it just break wherever your error is. So let's see that in VS Code, however. I have a script here. I've set my error action preference to break, and I have that same script, that error view script, and so we'll run it. So I'm just going to hit my start over there, putting in no arguments because it's regular, and boom. You see how I didn't have the script open, but because I told it to break on the next exception, it opened that file and went right to the place where I'm broken on. And you can see on the right, I have my variables, I have my watch. Really easy way where like, if I'm writing a program and all of a sudden this exception comes out of nowhere, all I got to do is set error action preference break, and VS Code will take me to that very specific line in my code where it broke, and then I can figure out what screwed up. Whereas in the past, you do watch, you might set a conditional breakpoint and hope you get it. And if you're doing things like long loops and it's breaking on just one input, had a weird format that you didn't account for, very, very painful. But now you just have this easy way to just simply be, just go to where the error happened and I'll figure it out from there. Really helps speed up that process. Okay, so let's move on. As far as there was a question about, can you define a custom error view of your own? I mean, you can, but I think you have to patch PowerShell or otherwise do an add type thing. It's not easy, but any object that emits to the console, you can set up your own types for that. My MS Terminal Settings module, which I might demo towards the end here, does that. You get a nice grid view of your profiles as opposed to the default view you're used to in PowerShell. But by default, it's not easy. So thanks for that question. So let's get on to the web request commandlets. For the commandlets, we have, this is how this functioned in PowerShell 5.1. So you have your commands, invoke web request and REST method, and these are actually built on top of this C#, .NET assembly library that's system.net web request. So what PowerShell 7 did was completely rewrite this into the HTTP client, which offers a lot more power, a lot more ability, a lot more flexibility. This was really designed for kind of REST API interaction, where the previous was meant for just kind of more general web requests. So this gives us a lot more power. So how much power? This is all the stuff you can do. There's a ton of new parameters. You've got all kinds of options, strict header parsing, customize requests, get it down to just what you need. If you have a very finicky API that expects very specific headers, you can adjust that. Follow links, don't use proxies, use proxies, skip certificate checks if you're just testing locally. I can go on and on and on, but if you really want to know more about the deep dives of this, I recommend this article, which is done by Mark Krause. This is the guy who actually did most of the rewrite of this, and he goes into great detail about what was fixed, what's improved, where the limitations are. There are some things, I know somebody was saying rewrites mean breaking changes. Yes, they do. Like for instance, interacting with FTP stuff no longer exists in 7. That was a breaking change. There's other modules that kind of fill that gap. Most of the commands will work as is. If you take your command as you wrote it in 5.1 and do it in 7, vast majority work as they used to. However, some might have some slight differences. But overall, it's a massive improvement. The OAuth authentication is built right in. So strongly recommend, if you're doing things with Invoke Web Request or Invoke REST method, definitely check them and test them. Run your pester tests against them on 7 before you move it up. But you should see a lot of performance improvements. And if there were things that became deal breakers that you maybe had to drop down to .NET or use another module for, a lot of that stuff you can now do in box with PowerShell 7. So let's talk a little bit about the .NET framework and what that has to do with PowerShell. Because if you work, if you're a PowerShell user, maybe you don't really care about .NET framework. You just want to use PowerShell. You don't have to care about .NET. Part of the reason you did PowerShell was like, at least I did, was like I didn't want to have to learn C#, and it was easier and it worked. So that's what I did. But this is kind of an important thing to know about to kind of get some ideas about the concepts and why certain things work the way they do in PowerShell 7 versus PowerShell 5.1. So we have a couple platforms. We have Windows, and on Windows, we have the .NET framework. The .NET framework is kind of what we know and love. It's what PowerShell has been written in since, since the beginning of PowerShell in the Monad days. And the .NET framework provides that framework, just like Python's written in C, and other languages have some sort of language generally below them that there's sort of an abstraction. PowerShell's abstraction is that it's written in C# on the .NET framework. And that's where we have Windows PowerShell. Unfortunately, .NET Framework only works on Windows. There are some, let's say it's only officially supported on Windows. There are some projects that came along on Linux and such to make it work, like Mono, but in general it was. As Microsoft grew, as Microsoft became more of an open source company, became more of a realization what needs to occur, they really found that there was a need to have PowerShell everywhere. It became a real credo to be able to have PowerShell everywhere and be able to make it ubiquitous, so that a lot of the PowerShell sacred vow that when you learn PowerShell, they will make it so that you don't have to relearn it and that it's the most important investment that you'll make and you can reuse it. This is the team working on keeping that promise. So we have these other platforms we want to work with. And so .NET Core came along. First, the .NET Core team basically rewrote the .NET framework in a way that could be done cross-platform and available. That was a huge, tremendous effort, and it took a while. And at the point of PowerShell 6 coming out, there was a lot of libraries and such, especially around graphical things, that weren't available. So a lot of the complaints about PowerShell 6 missing stuff that was in Windows PowerShell, that was primarily dependent on that stuff being implemented in .NET Core. A lot of that stuff is now implemented, and so we now have Windows PowerShell, or excuse me, PowerShell 7. So that background just gives you an idea of what's available, because PowerShell 7 has a different base. That's what allows it to run in so many more places. It runs everywhere .NET Core does. That's why the previous presentation about AWS, part of the reason PowerShell showed up so fast on AWS was that AWS implemented .NET Framework, and they realized that, hey, PowerShell is just a .NET application. So we just basically have to write a wrapper around a .NET application, and we have PowerShell support. I mean, if you work with AWS Lambda, you have effectively, you'll notice when you run it, it's basically just running a .NET compile and making a PowerShell host to run your AWS Lambdas. It doesn't really like run the PowerShell like quote unquote natively. And that's how it works with Azure Functions too. But there are other areas. If a competitor to Terraform is this project called Pulumi, and that's used for, again, infrastructure management, but they finally supported .NET. And in about 6 hours, I was able to write a proof of concept that lets you write Pulumi infrastructure code in PowerShell. Unfortunately, that I just wrote as a proof of concept. They haven't picked it up as on their roadmap yet, but it just gives an example of that. If something's in .NET or .NET Core, something comes along and has an API, it has an SDK, anything like that, then you can use it in PowerShell 7 or have somebody write a module to use it. And so that breadth of framework and have it available to work cross-platform on Mac, Windows, Linux, Raspberry Pi, etc., is huge. And so if you want to expand your scripts and the scope of what you're working on to work just beyond Windows, it's a very good reason to look at the new PowerShell. There's this thing called PowerShell Standard. Speaking of module builds, PowerShell Standard is a way to, when you're writing modules, especially binary modules, to make sure that what you're writing will work on both Windows PowerShell and PowerShell 7. So that you can write one module, and regardless if it's on Windows PowerShell or PowerShell 7, it will work fine. One very important key here is that, okay, great, I want to use PowerShell, I want to use PowerShell 7, but I don't want it to break anything. I don't want it to break all my Windows PowerShell. Well, the nice thing is that they are, because they run as different applications, they operate side by side. PowerShell is PowerShell exe, PowerShell 7 is pwsh.exe. So you can go ahead and deploy PowerShell 7 in your environment, install it everywhere, and it won't break a thing because all those things still use the old PowerShell. And then you can gradually tell them to use PowerShell 7 instead of Windows PowerShell. But if it doesn't work, you can just take it right back until you figure out what the issues are. So these two things running side by side is huge. It's a real common misconception that if I upgrade to PowerShell 7, I'm stuck with it, and that's not the case. When you install PowerShell 7, it's just basically installing another application. It's not a direct upgrade path. So you can have them side by side and be able to use them even more parallel than it was like moving from 2.0 to 3.0 and 4.0. So that's really useful to allow you to play with it, do it on your local computer, and just you can download it as a zip file and just use it as a local run space and play around with it, not have to install anything. So if part of your reasons you haven't been using PowerShell is because you're worried about that whole upgrade path and it breaking things at the moment you install it, that shouldn't be the case. So let's look at a few of the places that you can run Windows PowerShell. Excuse me, PowerShell 7. You run on Windows, which is obvious. You can run it on Mac now. It runs on Linux, any Linux instance. I'm going to go ahead and bring up here. I have a Windows subsystem for Linux running on my Surface Laptop 3 here, and I have here a Ubuntu prompt. This is an Ubuntu sys shell running directly on my system, and I'm here in PowerShell. Here's my Linux system. I'm running on. Here's my C users. Here's PowerShell 7. But this is in an Ubuntu, what is effectively a virtual machine. And it works just fine. Works on Alpine, works on these. So if you want to try it with Linux, if you have a Linux thing and you want to test it out, you can run it without having to have a completely separate Linux box. You can use Windows Subsystem for Linux on a Windows system and do all that kind of development right here. Works on Raspberry Pis. There's more and more embedding, and PowerShell 7.1 is working on a much more minified version of PowerShell that will work in more embedded places. But it works basically anywhere you have an x86 or ARM processor, and Raspberry Pis have ARM processors, so you can run PowerShell on a Raspberry Pi. I do some fun home automation stuff with that. You can run it in a Docker. It has a fully supported Docker container that you can just download, run. I run a lot of our processes that need a little bit more than, like for instance, Azure Functions has like a 5-minute runtime for a script. If I have something that needs to be a huge batch, I can have my Azure Function just call a container that runs my script, and that container will run as long as the script takes, 3 hours a day, and then tear it back down. But I don't have to keep a separate machine running and paying for that cost. One way to deploy Dockers is Azure Container Instances, Azure Container Services. Very easy way where just with one command, you can spin up a container in your Azure environment, run it, and have it tear down. Very simple from the AZ command line or the Windows PowerShell. You don't really have to know a whole lot about containers to use it. Really super helpful. AWS Lambda, as was very well presented earlier today, works perfectly fine there. And Azure Functions, which is another great serverless environment to run PowerShell in. Currently, Azure Functions is on PowerShell 6. You can download the beta, download it for your local, and work on PowerShell 7 functions. And you can also set up your own instance so that your functions can be PowerShell 7. But for it to work in sort of the serverless consumption plan, they're waiting on approvals. Like the code's done, it just has to go through approvals, hoping this month, next month. But the nature of that is that they can't really give us a timeline. But right now it's looking like a month or two out, and then you'll be able to use PowerShell 7 there. I didn't mention Azure Cloud Shell here because that's just another thing, obviously, but that Cloud Shell is in 7. So there's another example. Question was like, what's the PowerShell 7 equivalent of new web service proxy? That's another one of those breaking changes. Those kind of SOAP API type things are generally not available. If you need what new web service proxy, that's what the compatibility layer is for. You can shim in new web service proxy using the Windows PowerShell compatibility module and be able to use it just fine there. I've used it, it works fine. It exists in that background Windows PowerShell instance rather than in PowerShell 7 native. But you can use it in your PowerShell 7 scripts. It just actually runs in Windows PowerShell in the background. Okay, so you got this. How can you install PowerShell 7? You're jazzed, you want to do it. Here's some options. This is sort of the simplest one, is you can install you can install PowerShell 7 with PowerShell. This line here, if you run that, we'll download the MSI, install it, and install it to your computer. There are plenty of command line scripts for that. If you don't want to use the MSI, if you want to just download a zip, if you want to save it to a path, if you want to do any of that kind of stuff, this one line is how you can just drop it anywhere. You just take that script, you run it, it works. It goes out and fetches that script. At this point, I'm going to do my codicil. Even though this comes directly from the PowerShell team, you should never run any script from the internet before you read it first. That being said, you run that one, that should do it. If you want to deploy it by zip, anywhere you can download a zip file and extract it, you can generally run it. For a lot of my CI builds where I need to do tests against it, I just download the zip, extract it, and then run it inside that folder, and it works just as well. You can do it. Don't need admin rights to install it. You can copy it anywhere you want. Works on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, perfectly fine. So you can just go to this URL and download it. You can go to the GitHub releases to get the specific URLs for your platform that you're testing, but basically where I have that OS bolded up there is where you want to replace with Windows or Win or Linux or ARM, x64, etc. Chocolatey, we were talking about Chocolatey earlier. Chocolatey is a great tool to do it. Chocolatey install PowerShell core. If you want to do it without admin rights, there's a PowerShell.portable, and then you can redirect to a path that you want to put it in. But Chocolatey is great for like if you want to push it out on a lot of systems and be able to have it available and admin rights for all users. Great way to install it. One line command, good to go. Another tool is Scoop. Scoop is a package manager which is written completely in PowerShell. And Scoop is a way to install the tool locally on your thing. Great for dev environments. Great for if you're just working on your local computer and you want to update it. Doesn't require admin rights. Installs very quickly. Shims things in so it doesn't pollute your path with a bunch of things. Really handy way to quickly install things. I know the Chocolatey guys are going to want me to put a big red X over that, but I'm just letting you know it's an option. I like it. Snapcraft, if you work on Linux and you're familiar with like snaps, which are sort of like containerized programs, there's a snap for it. You can run it with Docker. I was talking about that one-liner. If you have Docker on your computer or WSL2, etc., this is a way that you can start it. There's a slightly modified command to do it with ACI, but if you run that command, that will start a Docker container and bring you up the PowerShell prompt, and boom, you have PowerShell 7 running in a container. Doesn't touch your system at all. You can play with it and then just delete it when you're done. So writing scripts, the tools also have improved. If you're familiar with the venerable PowerShell ISE, I've been using this, for over a decade. And when this newfangled thing called VS Code came along, I was really resistant to it too. I really liked ISE. I knew ISE. I knew how to do my F8s. I first got into it. The PowerShell extension was a little rough, and it wasn't a great first kind of experience. So, but that has improved dramatically, and I cannot hesitate but to recommend, if you're still using ISE, to give VS Code a shot, especially if you haven't tried using it in the last few months. If you tried using it like a year ago and it left a bad taste in your mouth, the extension has been completely rewritten, and it is awesome. It is very much more powerful, much more stable, and big ups on Tyler and parts of the PowerShell team who really made that work huge, really big. So please, please try it. Now, if you're still used to ISE and you want to use code, but you're still kind of used to ISE, thankfully, there's this thing called the ISE compatibility mode for VS Code, where this is what it'll look like when you just turn on that thing. And as you can see, looks pretty much the same. behaves fairly similar for the same, extremely useful. So this is a way that if you're not using VS Code yet, you can still get that kind of look and feel, and this can be your kind of bridge into using VS Code, but still be used to it. Have the same buttons at the top for run selection, etc. All of this is very nice in the new version 7. So if you have that, it's great. There's a question from Matt Holia, does the integrated terminal still suck? No, that has been fixed. And in the stable, it is good too. The PS read line works. It is pretty much the same. It works great now. It is much, much better. And so definitely try it. If the last time you used it, you had the really crappy one that didn't support the syntax highlighting or any of that kind of stuff, super rad. Definitely try it out. If you haven't updated your VS Code extension or anything like that, it is the stable one. The preview has some new stuff, but it used to be that the preview was the really good one and stable was the old one. Now the preview has moved to stable. The stable is great. Please definitely, I can't implore you enough, if you haven't tried VS Code lately, give it another shot. Just give it another chance. And if you try it out and you kind of like it, Tyler, who did most of the rewrite, will be doing a presentation actually at 4 o'clock Pacific today, which unfortunately for the PowerShell Chattanooga meetup, which unfortunately conflicts with BridgeConf, but it will be recorded. So just keep this in mind that this is available. Tyler is going to go through everything and really help you transition from ISE to using Visual Studio Code. Going to be a great presentation. Definitely recommend checking it out. So I'm going to close with this tweet from the man Snover a little while ago that I just want to agree with, is that the PowerShell team made a promise so important called the Sacred Vow. If you learn PowerShell, they will do everything they can to make sure that it's the best investment you ever made. It's 13 years later, and I can confidently say that we have kept faith with that vow. Having used PowerShell for 12 years, PowerShell is the greatest skill that I ever learned for my career, and the stuff that I was doing 10 years ago still relevant today, even as it evolves, grows, and is available everywhere. So I say the team is doing a great job working on that goal and keeping that promise that if you learn PowerShell, it'll be one of the greatest investments you make in your skills. So thank you very much. Coming up next will be a Q&A with the PowerShell team. And for a fun quick of my MS Terminal settings module, I just want to say thanks. We have a couple minutes, so if there's any questions, go ahead and pop them up there. I'll answer questions for the next 2 minutes. And otherwise, again, I'll do it again. Thanks very much. Yeah, link for the meetup. If you just Google, for Tyler's presentation on the VS Code, it's for the Chattanooga user group. I'm sure if you Google it, it'll definitely be on his Twitter handle. Let's see if I can pull that up here real quick. One thing that's not in this presentation I didn't show is the newest version of PS Reline, which you probably saw there, has this nice little autocomplete. So if you're using the latest version of Visual Studio Code, it will autocomplete from your history very nicely. So if I do a git, see this little faded where you can see that, you can go up and see all the times you did a git and get back to that command, just hit right to autocomplete it and run it. So handy little thing, very, very new, not part of this presentation, but there's a nice little tip and trick. Yeah, arrow key right by the default. You'll want to rebind your PS readline options for up, so that up kind of goes through your history rather than your most recent commands. And that's what kind of does the very simple like complete, where it shows what you typed in blue and then your various autocompletes to the right. Really handy. Yeah, fish shell. This was inspired by the fish shell, and so now it's there in the newest PS readline beta. If you use the latest extension of VS Code, it should just be there as part of the PS readline beta, and eventually it will be part of the code. They're going to expand it. There is an issue out there about syntax highlighting, and it's going to be much more intelligent, do parameter completion, all that kind of stuff. For each object parallel, I just use a variable test host. It was just an array of hosts like Facebook, Google, etc. This presentation will be available after the BridgeConf. I'll make this slide deck available so that you can use it. Piedovic, about the PS readline, that is actually, if you're using the latest PowerShell preview extension, it actually has it embedded in it. So you actually don't have to update your PS readline. You do have to update it if you want to see it on your console. You have to use the latest PS readline preview. What you can do is just install a module, PS readline, allow pre-release. CrossInc has the link for the PowerShell Chattanooga meetup, so that's great. And Tyler will have his information on his stream as well. All right, that's my time. Thanks again very much. And coming up next is the PowerShell team.